The U.S. attracts more than 1 million international students each year, the highest number of foreign students in the world. When the coronavirus pandemic hit the U.S., colleges and universities were among the first institutions to close and go remote. Most schools waited to see how the pandemic would turn out before giving guidance to their students for the fall semester. At the time, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement made an exception and allowed foreign students to participate in remote learning. But then it reversed the decision a few months later.
The latest from Immigration and Customs Enforcement saying that there could be a big issue with international students coming to school or international students possibly being deported if their classes were all online.
2 days later, Harvard and MIT led a charge of more than 200 universities, tech companies, and states in filing lawsuits against the administration to temporarily block the new rule change.
It will cause them financial hardship. It is already causing deep emotional pain for them and their families.
The Trump administration and major U.S. universities led by Harvard and MIT have reached a settlement today that would see the White House rescind its policy announced just days ago.
Though currently enrolled international students were granted a reprieve, 10 days later, ICE reinforced their March guidance that new international students wouldn't be able to enter the U.S. if their courses go online only.
Because it came out of nowhere, it's possible that it can come up again in the future. And so it's still a little bit unsettling to be an international student because you don't know what the future could hold.
International students make up 5.5% of students at U.S. colleges and universities. They also contributed almost $45 billion to the U.S. economy in 2018. The number of new international students in the U.S. has declined over the last 5 years as students turn to countries with more welcoming immigration policies and cheaper tuition costs. U.S. universities and colleges rely heavily on foreign students for tuition revenue and research and will have to reevaluate their programs if the trend continues. Here's how fewer international students could affect the U.S. economy. In the last decade, the U.S. has seen historic numbers for the number of international students in the U.S. In 2018, more than 1 million international students came to the U.S. for education, the highest it's seen in the last decade. But in the last few years, the U.S. has also made it harder for international students to study in the U.S. While the visa process has become more restrictive, the practice of regulating students can be traced back to almost 20 years ago.
There have been regulations in place that restrict the number of international students who can come to the United States and the terms for their stay in the United States, going back a long time, but especially since 9/11. And one of the reasons that the government has been so concerned about checking in on international students is because it was revealed that some of the terrorists in the 9/11 attacks had overstayed student visas. And so that was a significant reason that the government has been watching this body very closely. Of course, that's not all international students, but after 9/11, there was a creation of a whole system called the Student and Exchange Visitor Information System, or SEVIS.
SEVIS is a system that tracks and monitors schools, students, and their dependents during their program of study in the U.S. It also mandates that schools submit updated information on students so they do not overstay their visas. Most international students who wish to study at an academic institution in the U.S. apply for a temporary visa called the F1. The visa requires a full course load, one which may be an online class, and restricts the ability of the student to work off campus. Failure to meet these can lead to deportation or refusal of entry. After a student finishes their program, they have 60 days to leave the country, or if eligible, can switch to the optional practical training program, known as OPT. OPT allows students to temporarily work in the U.S. from 12 to 36 months. Timing varies depending on their major. The work also must be directly related to their program of study. More on that later. U.S. colleges and universities have lost many of their revenue sources amid the coronavirus pandemic. The American Council on Education, which represents 1,700 universities and education-related associations, in a letter to the House of Representatives said, "We estimate that enrollment for the next academic year will drop by 15%, including a projected decline of 25% for international students." resulting in a revenue loss for institutions of $23 billion.
Many of our institutions had to pivot to online only, establish platforms, refund money to students for housing and things like that. And then also a lot of the auxiliary services. So things like hotels on campus that would have been booked for graduation, the sports teams playing, bringing that type of money onto campus. That all went away. With the international enrollment also falling, that's going to have a real financial impact on our institutions. We just don't know how big that impact is going to be yet.
Prior to the coronavirus pandemic, universities and colleges were already in a fragile financial state, especially those that rely heavily on tuition and state funding. To break even, some public universities have resorted to heavily recruiting international students.
Public universities generally charge more for out-of-state students than in-state students, and international students, of course, are never in-state students. So it's not uncommon for international students to be paying triple the tuition that local students pay, and universities use this to subsidize local students. There's a very big increase in this after the Great Recession. Part of that is states cut the public higher education budget significantly. It hasn't really recovered, and so the international students have become an increasingly important source of revenue for many schools.
U.S. postgraduate and doctoral level programs could also see an impact. In 2018, more than 18% of the students in these programs were international students. Their largest presence was in computer science and engineering programs, where they accounted for more than 57% of enrollments. It's important to note that experts attribute the high enrollment numbers to a domestic recruitment problem. According to the World Bank, university padding grants increased 6.8% for every 10% of international students. That means innovation suffers when fewer international students enroll in science, math, engineering, and technology programs in the U.S. It's students like Aktan Chan Shengun who support these departments. He doesn't fit the image of the stereotypical wealthy international student. While 57% of international students pay for their education through personal or family means, 16.8% have their education paid for by their U.S. university.
The most that my family was able to contribute to my undergraduate education was $5,000 a year. So any amount that I ask of them on top of that would be too much, and it would be a burden on their financial status. When I applied to University of Chicago, that's what I told them in my application. I can only pay $5,000 a year to you. And luckily they accepted my application, and on top of that, they offered me financial aid enough to cover everything but that last $5,000.
Fewer international students aren't the only thing that could hurt these programs. The loss of other temporary visa holders could as well.
Many of them are faculty members that are hired under H-1Bs that are included under that June 22nd presidential proclamation. And so this is going to have long-term economic impacts, not just for higher education, but really the entire United States. There's also a huge economic impact from the people that decide to stay here, that, our U.S. institutions have educated and have trained, and they decide to stay here either to start a business or to work for one of our U.S. tech companies, or to remain as a faculty member and actually train the next generation.
They are one of the most successful exports the United States has. For example, the value of exports of higher education are higher than the exports of soybeans from the United States. Students bring a lot of tuition to the United States. They also, of course, buy pizza and they rent apartments and do all the things that American students do, but they're taking their money from other countries and giving it to us. So the United States, of course, runs a bad balance of trade because we import more than we export, and higher education is one of the major exceptions where we export much more than we import.
International students contributed about $41 billion to the U.S. economy during the 2018-19 school year. That's according to an analysis from NAFSA, an organization that promotes international education. It said that more than 458,000 U.S. jobs were created thanks to international students, supported by their spending on things like retail, dining, and transportation, to name a few. China sends the most international students to the United States. In 2018, more than a third of international students in the U.S. came from China. Most universities are unprepared for tuition loss from the pandemic.
But the University of Illinois is prepared. 2 years ago, the university's business school and the engineering school bought an insurance policy that would pay out if there is a substantial drop in revenues from Chinese students. The insurance pays out if revenues fall more than 18.5%. So if it falls 20%, they get a $12 million payout. Now, the premium is $424,000 a year, and the policy was syndicated through underwriters at the Lloyd's of London.
The school declined to comment to CNBC, citing a confidentiality clause. Many big-name universities won't see an impact, but for the smaller universities, financial damage could result in fewer campuses, programs, and workers. Beyond the quality of U.S. higher education, another draw for international students are the job prospects offered through the optional practical training program. After students graduate, they can apply for temporary employment as an extension of their student visas through the OPT program. In 2018, 223,085 students or recent grads were in the OPT program, an increase of more than 9% from 2017.
That's a really significant motivator for a lot of international students who come to the U.S. to study, because under the normal terms of their visa, they wouldn't be able to work in the United States. It's only through programs like the OPT that they're able to gain that experience, potentially develop ties to future employers who might then decide to sponsor them for an H-1B visa or even permanent employment that could lead to a green card.
The reason why I was so stressed about this ban was because I've always dreamed of working in the States after graduating. And so this ban would have not allowed me to apply for the OPT work visa that I have to be in the country to apply for. Not being allowed into the country to hand in that application would have meant that I wouldn't have had a chance at kind of achieving my dream of working in New York.
Unwelcoming immigration policies are one of the main reasons why new foreign student enrollment in U.S. universities has declined since 2016. According to a NAFSA survey, other reasons why students aren't coming to the U.S. include visa delays or denials, the social and political environment, and increasing enrollment at universities in other countries. NAFSA estimates it has cost the U.S. economy $11.8 billion and more than 65,000 jobs. This comes at a time when students are studying abroad more than ever. Since 2001, the number of international students around the world has doubled from 2.1 million to 5.3 million.
What we've seen with the restrictive visa policies of this administration is a lot of concern coming from our international students. We've seen a slowdown on new international enrollments, and we've seen a lot of efforts by our competitors, such as in the UK, Australia, and Canada, to try and jump in and recruit some of those students by creating less restrictive visa policies as a way to be more attractive.
The U.S. OPT program caps students at 36 months if students complete a science, technology, engineering, or math degree, and 12 months for other majors. Canada's program allows students to work a max of 3 years. Australia's program goes for up to 18 months. In 2018, both countries saw an international student enrollment increase of at least 15%. In 2019, the UK voted to revert back to their previous work policy of 24 months after concern over a competitive disadvantage when compared to other countries with longer post-study work programs. The country's current policy was put in place in 2012 and only allowed students to work 4 months. The change will take place in summer 2021. The Trump administration has considered ending the OPT program. Opponents of the program argue it takes away jobs from Americans. Companies are not required to pay a competitive wage to OPT workers, which could make them cheaper than American workers. Supporters of OPT say the program is a pipeline for the U.S. STEM workforce. According to a 2016 study from the National Foundation for American Policy, nearly 1/4 of the U.S.'s $1 billion startup companies had founders who first came to the U.S. as an international student. The Business Roundtable, a nonprofit group representing big corporations, laid out how the end of the program could affect the U.S. economy in a 2018 study. The real U.S. GDP could decline 0.25 percentage point by 2028 and lose nearly 500,000 jobs in the U.S., half of which would be for native workers.
colleges and universities have tried to make our international students feel welcome. So when you looked at the Harvard-MIT case that was brought against the Department of Homeland Security about the July 6th guidance, one of the things that the president of MIT stated in the news release was that this was a message to our international students that we welcome you. We want to remain welcoming. And so I think that the visa policies need to be rethought in a way to carry that message to our international students that we're trying to recruit.
There are a lot of immigration scholars and immigration attorneys who see the current policies to restrict international students as part of a broader effort to use the pandemic as a vehicle for pushing through highly restrictionist policies. And the administration has been defined by wanting to pursue a number of different limitations to legal migration, anything from green cards to immigrant workers on H-1Bs, possibly to the OPT program and also to international students. And COVID-19 has given them a shortcut through many of those policies.
The implications for the U.S. go beyond the economic impact.
In other countries, who gets to come to the United States to college? Well, it tends to be people from relatively well-off families. It tends to be people from the elites in those places. It tends to be the future leaders. So if you look around the world, there are lots of prime ministers and finance ministers and treasury secretaries who have American degrees. They came to the United States, they took what they learned home, but they're likely to also try to look favorably on the United States. And it's just very unfortunate if we should forget that.